Osteoarthritis now is the #1 disability in the United States. It far outreaches all the others that we treat, and the #1 joint affected by osteoarthritis is the knee. So I think it makes sense to focus on this, especially in terms of prevention, in hopes of trying to avoid some of these problems, because we know at this point our treatment programs are imperfect. So in terms of preventing injuries, there's several areas that we're currently working on. Several through the Bone and Joint Injury Prevention Center. We look at the biomechanics, which frequently involves how the muscles work. We study the anatomical differences, trying to figure out what the difference is for the genders. We have done a fair amount of work on hormones, and we also look at the environment, what things athletes use in terms of equipment and conditions that may be affecting the injury rate. So part of the prevention paradigm and part of the challenge for us at the Injury Prevention Center is understanding the causes. What causes these problems? Because if we don't understand the causes, we certainly can't develop risk factor surveillance programs. We can't look at training programs for the young and for the athletes unless we really know what causes the injuries. So first factor to look at, biomechanics. Muscles provide the dynamic protection of the knee. They're not only shock absorbers, but they're stress relievers. They're capable of protecting all of those very delicate structures that Ryan mentioned just earlier. And yes, when you think about the forces that are transmitted across the knee, they can be quite high. With activities of daily living, probably 6 or 7 times body weight is pretty reasonable. When you think about that, if you gain 10 pounds over Christmas, you just added another 60 to 70 pounds to your knee with every step you take. So weight is a big factor with knee injuries and knee osteoarthritis, and it's something that we have to deal with on a regular basis. So in order to get at this ACL injury mechanism, we've been working hard at the university. This is our one study that is now funded by the National Institutes of Health, but it took us about 7 years to get to that point. It's a research team that includes kinesiologists with Dr. Ryan Palmieri-Smith, Dr. James Ashton Miller, who's in mechanical engineering, and also orthopedists, all working together to try to figure this out. This is our testing system in the center, and this device allows us to look at cadaver knees and simulate jump landings. So we can actually produce the forces, the motions, and the muscle activities that happen when you jump, which is where a lot of these injuries occur. And by looking at that data, we can tell which ligaments are being strained and which muscle patterns can protect the knee joint. One of the things that we've learned in this research is that the muscles, especially the hamstring muscles, for instance, when it comes to anterior cruciate ligaments, these are extremely important. And this has allowed us to focus more and more of our prevention efforts on training athletes properly in developing patterns that will hopefully protect knees and not injure them. So from this research, we actually realized that the impact force, how hard you land, many times isn't what injures your knees, but it's the positioning and also the muscle activity that's critical to what happens in the knee joint. So that brings us to the area of training. Training is critically important for young athletes. If we don't train them properly, and you can see some reasons why we think that that may be the case, why those problems continue to persist today. Training develops muscle tension across the knee joint, and muscle tension is your first line of defense. Whether you're sitting there and watching TV or whether you're running, you still have a certain amount of tension across the joint. Obviously, it varies with what activity you're doing. But we've published research looking at what happens when you move the knee in line and also when you move the knee in a rotation movement. And some of the interesting findings are these. This is a rotational study where we actually move the knee in a rotational way and ask patients and participants to resist that movement. So it was a measure of their ability to protect the knee in a rotational way. And we looked at male athletes that were in jumping, turning, twisting sports, and they were able to increase the resistance from rest to a full contraction by about 258%. When we looked at male athletes that didn't do the jumping, turning, twisting sports, but were nevertheless good athletes, swimmers, cyclists, things like that, they did it somewhat less, but still could increase that resistance over 200%. When we got to females who were good athletes, runners, swimmers, cyclists, but never did jumping, turning, twisting sports, they did still pretty good, about 200%. But interestingly, the females in the group that played basketball, soccer, volleyball, and actually did those sports, did the worst of all the groups. Now, these actually happened to be University of Michigan athletes, and we stopped for a second and said, you know, could we be recruiting athletes that just weren't that good, or that wasn't no pun intended there. But the other option is that, you know, maybe we're just not training and conditioning female athletes properly. And maybe that's why the ones who've had the most exposure, the most training, the most benefits, the most sophisticated systems we have, still are not getting the protection they need because they're not the same as guys. They need to be trained and conditioned differently.